This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Today on the podcast, I have Larry Doyle. His book, In Bed with Wall Street. Former JP Morgan banker who gets into the nitty-gritty of regulation, of politics, of elite, and why this system is freaking fragile as hell, even though we're 5-6 years removed from the so-called crisis. Might not be the most entertaining in terms of content, but I would argue that it's a very important conversation. I hope you enjoy. Why don't you explain to me, so your book, In Bed with Wall Street, and you know the quick and dirty version would be, this is the political, regulatory, elite, what's been going on behind the scenes and all the funny monkey business for the last decade or so, even going back farther perhaps. And you've painstakingly broken this stuff down, and you've really gone after a lot of the regulatory arms. And, you know, somebody might be already thinking, hey, you know, I don't care. I just want to trade. I don't care about all this stuff. It's not relevant to me. I don't think so. I think it's very relevant.
Yeah, I agree.
It's very relevant. So let me just jump right in. Why? Give me a little bit about your background and why did you put this book together?
Well, first off, I worked on the sell side of Wall Street within those large banks for 23 years, trading, selling, and running businesses. And I left JP Morgan in 2006. And, at that point in time, there were clearly some signs of stress within the markets. And, oftentimes you can get into those large organizations, but you can't get out. So when I was afforded the opportunity to get out, I took it, the idea of moving on to, doing more personal, entrepreneurial pursuits, kind of more working for myself. And then, you watch the world and the markets melt down. 2008. I would say that, here we are 6 years after the fact, but most people would say there's only really 1 year that could be compared to, and that was 1929. So I didn't want to just merely be a spectator, and so I started writing. I launched my own blog in January of 2009, having no idea where it would take me, but then started, watching some hearings. And what I was really intrigued by was not necessarily what had happened, because I understood that, the leverage and mortgages and fraud, I got that. Not really why it happened, just, excessive greed. I mean, come on, everybody gets that. But really how it happened, meaning, okay, where were the regulators? How did the industry engage their regulators? And what I wanted to try to do is bring to bear what I would view as, arcane material that had broad-based impact. That was really kind of how I wanted to try to define myself as a writer. But again, this was all I wasn't thinking book back in 2009. I was purely blogging.
Well, let me jump into some specifics and some examples. And there's no way with a book like yours that we can break it apart. People would just have to go read. And it is dense, and it's got some academic overtone, and it's not necessarily a fun read, but I might argue that it's an important read. So let me just start with one big example that a lot of people know about. And the time has passed a little, but Bernard Madoff was a pretty big name. And what I want you to expand on is beyond what I'm going to describe it as. I look at Bernard Madoff and say, you know what? A lot of really dumb fucking people trusted a really sleazy guy. Okay. There's a lot of truth to that. Okay. However, I have a feeling behind the scenes from a regulatory standpoint, there was a lot of things that were missed, which should cause us all concern to this day. Am I wrong?
You are 1,000% correct, and that is that's kind of the essence of what this book is ultimately all about.
Well, I'll tell you what, dig into Madoff and explain it for people that are listening that just think, who cares? Rich guys swindled other rich guys. Who gives a shit? It's over. But why don't you explain why it's not really over for all of us?
Well, it's not over because whether it's Bernard Madoff or other financial firms, whether they're asset management firms, investment management, hedge funds, large banks, or whatever, these are all in one way, shape, or form. They're supposed to be regulated for the benefit of investors and ultimately the public. So who was Madoff's primary regulator? Because Madoff was all housed under a broker dealer. Where the swindle and the scam occurred within his investment management, that was not set aside from a pure broker dealer operation until 2007. So his primary regulator was an outfit called the NASD, the National Association of Securities Dealers. They were the primary regulator, and that's a self-regulatory organization, meaning that whether it was Madoff himself or Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and Merrill Lynch, every large, medium, and small broker dealer would fund this organization, which was the National Association of Securities Dealers. And now that organization is known as FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, so that those regulators could regulate those firms. So that on its face presents massive conflicts of interest. To think that you've got Goldman and Madoff funding this regulator so that the regulator can aggressively oversee them. When people just think of that, they're like, okay, well, how the hell does that work? And the fact is, it doesn't work. But when you dig into it, you realize that it not only didn't work, but the level of fines that FINRA and prior to that the NASD imposed on these firms, I defined they were barely even parking tickets. And so what's the concern there? The concern is, again, the ripple effect that has across all markets, because it gets to, okay, if markets aren't being properly regulated and firms aren't being properly regulated, bad things occur that have enormous ripple effects in terms of, people's own investments. And that's exactly what has played out here and continues to play out.
Larry, let me jump into something even more specific on Madoff. So, I know I looked at it years back and read some of the details. I mean, the main whistleblower that everybody ignored for the longest time, he had it all pinned down and knew exactly what was going on. Did it ever get to the point where people said, was this just Madoff that was just able to hide this all? Or were there other people involved? And if their involvement was not necessarily direct, was it indirect because they were so freaking incompetent? Both.
Well, I mean, there was both not only incompetence, but clearly there was corruption that occurred here. So let me great way of teeing that up. I read the trustees report, the Madoff trustees report looking into JP Morgan. JP Morgan was Madoff's bank, main bank for over 20 years. And I read that report in the volume of circuitous transactions where I think even a novice would just say, hey, wait a second. All these security, I mean, if that's not the definition of money laundering 101, and that went on for years. Any banker's main, primary first rule of doing business is what is known as KYC, know your customer. So clearly, the Madoff operation was probably a significant revenue producer for JP Morgan, and I think it's probably a combination of both turning a cheek or a blind eye, but they failed to properly supervise and to know your customer, and they had an obligation. They had an obligation to bring information to the regulators and ultimately, officials, and they failed to do that. And they get away with a $1.7 billion fine for aiding and abetting a fraud that went on for, over 2 decades. That doesn't pass the smell test. So that's a problem. Nobody is held to account. Okay, but over and above that, the regulators, both from the SEC, the NASD, and FINRA, they visited Madoff's offices. They have an obligation to thoroughly investigate. They're not investigators, to thoroughly investigate, connecting the dots, following the money. But, Madoff himself and his family members, they were some of the founding individuals of the NASDAQ, the primary stock exchange that is the competitor to the NYSE. So, I think Mary Shapiro should be subpoenaed. Mary Shapiro, the former SEC chairperson, should be subpoenaed and compelled to testify. That never really happened. This self-regulatory entity did a self-investigation, of their oversight of FINRA. I mean, that is just like, are you kidding me? That's, talk about insult to injury.
Well, I saw the one title in your book, and I saw the title incest, and I scribbled down on a piece of paper. I said incest is best. And, I think that's what's really going on here. Let me shift into another example, and then I want to bring it to some of the supposed fixes, i.e. Dodd Frank. One other example I want to jump into with you, MF Global. So, a lot of people that I've been involved with over the years in the future space, and MF Global just cracked that fantastic, speaking of self-regulation, that's fantastic self-regulated. We always honor our debts, so to speak. And MF Global just cracked that in the futures industry, and it just fell apart.
Yep. Well, MF Global broke the sacrosanct law that you don't touch customer funds, and that wasn't. They broke this sacrosanct law that you don't touch customer funds, and you've got people taking the fifth. Jon Corzine, one of President Obama's primary bundlers of campaign funds, is afforded enormous protection by the Justice Department. I was like, again, this doesn't come anywhere close to passing the smell test. And the message that gets sent not only to investors, but the general public is enormous double standard. I mean, I engaged, people who held their accounts at MF Global that couldn't access their cash and still can't. I mean, we're talking small farmers out in the Midwest, who are hedging their crops. And they're like, "Are you kidding me?" And again, the biggest cost of all is just a total erosion of trust and confidence, a view that the rule of law is degraded, and just this idea of if capital is not protected, what happens? Then people will choose not to commit capital, and that has a significant impact in terms of slowing the economy. So Jon Corzine should have been indicted, in my opinion, along with others from MF Global, and that's a problem. But that's another example of just this ongoing incestuous relationship between senior bankers, regulators, and the folks in Washington.
Let me let you go to what one of the supposed fixes was after the 08-09 time period, which is Dodd Frank. Why don't I let you go ahead and explain to the audience what Dodd Frank did, or what it said it was going to do, and where it actually stands?
Well, I mean, Dodd Frank was promoted as bringing reform to Wall Street. It was the Dodd Frank financial regulatory reform legislation in consumer, financial protection. But really, what you have to look at is the fact that Dodd Frank was not, even though it was 2,300 pages in length, it was an architectural blueprint much more than it was, a completed piece of legislation. And so here it is.
Why don't you explain that so people can follow along? Because listen, for a lot of people, Dodd Frank, they hear it, it's like, yeah, whatever, past my attention span, I don't care, whatever, next. So it might be useful if you kind of like just break it down a little bit, what it attempted to do at least.
Well, what it attempted to do was in bringing reform to Wall Street in terms of, leverage, the amount of capital that banks would have to hold, how they would engage, whether it's clients or regulators, on a whole host of topics. Underwriting. I mean, it was this massive piece of legislation. Some people think that it's truly overkill. But again, here was Senator Dodd from Connecticut, Barney Frank, Congressman Barney Frank from Massachusetts. And I say, first and foremost, I mean, here, these were two individuals, that headed the Senate Finance and the House Banking. They had, themselves been longstanding beneficiaries of, kind of feeding at the Wall Street and related troughs, primarily Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So they had benefited, enormously from Wall Street, and here they are now charged with trying to go in and clean it up. So they work their way through this. It's sold to the American public as, okay, we've reformed the industry. And you know what? It is a total bill of goods. Because here it is 6 years after the 5 years after the fact, or going on 5 years since this legislation was passed, only about 40% of the legislation has been implemented. It's been massively watered down, because what happens is when the actual laws and rules are written, what happens is the Wall Street lobbyists go in there and often are engaged by the staff, the congressional staff, to actually, to write the rules that were kind of defined by Dodd Frank. And so what they do is, it's like Swiss cheese, enormous holes within, these various pieces of the legislation in which Wall Street can get around it. So I think that Dodd Frank is largely ineffectual in what it really doesn't do. It tried to put a cost on this too big to fail problem instead of fully addressing it. And so what it's done is it's actually cemented a too big to fail banking model rather than, addressing it and alleviating it. And that's the elephant in the room that not only investors and taxpayers in America have to deal with, but truly around the world as well.
Okay, so let me get into, as I was thinking about this conversation, I was thinking, well, I don't know if we would have a debate about this, but you end your book somewhat optimistically, or at least you give a prescription and you say, here are some directions we can go regulatory wise, and these can have great benefits. To play devil's advocate, I'm sitting here and I'm saying to myself, Goldman Sachs was gone, dead, buried. Morgan Stanley, gone, dead, buried. GM, gone, dead, buried. They were resurrected by nothing short of some of the most fantastic crony capitalistic moves in the history of, quote, capitalism. So I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about this and I'm like, and then I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. The mother's milk is, to the politicians, and it's not the left, it's the right, it's both sides of the coin. I mean, seriously, I don't really know how we could ever expect, after witnessing the last 5 years, that there's ever going to be regulatory reforms that we can count on. And so where I'm really going with that is, what options do we have as individuals, as companies that are trying to run honorable lives? What options do we have in the midst of a system that can best be described as shitty and will probably, if we look at the past history, will probably just get shittier? What options do we really have? Am I wrong?
I concur with what you're saying. And, what are the options? In my opinion, two things have to happen. People need to become informed, okay? And they're, to a large extent, not informed by the general media on these topics.
Okay, but that's not going to happen, is it? How?
I think people are becoming more informed. Certainly not to the point that nowhere close to what we need, not even close. But I think that people are becoming more informed slowly. And why do I say that? Because I think when I look at measurements of the level of trust and confidence in media, in banking, in politics, I mean, they're all barely above single digit levels. And so when people, they don't trust these crowds, what do? You shy away from them. But this is what we got to deal with. And so I do believe that people now are, I hate to say that they're kind of resigned. I do think there's this sense of resignation, But underlying, I think this issue of corruption is the one issue that really unifies both those on the right and the left. There's not much that unifies the right and the left, but I think this issue of corruption within the system is the great unifying issue.
That's true. I think that's a fair statement. But look, the equity markets are all-time highs, regardless of whether or not we have zero interest rate policy and interest income has been obliterated. Equity markets are all-time highs. I've personally looked at it almost as a bribe. So those people that were so scared after the crash, didn't know what was going to happen, worried the ATMs weren't going to work, they couldn't get cash, not sure what was going to happen in the stock market when it was at those lows in March of 2009. But now everything is, at least from the equity market standpoint, is rosy. And so, it's almost like a bribe of like, hey, we're running the system. We're doing as we please. We've raised the stocks to all-time highs. You, the general public, don't know what's going on. We control the system. You can't get rid of us. So just take your all-time high stock market and pipe down.
Yeah, but the problem with that is markets are massively manipulated, whether it's the base rates, whether it's the Fed funds rate or all the quantitative easing, whether it's the manipulation that occurs through the high frequency trading. And believe me, I understand, what Ben Bernanke did and why he did it and why Tim Geithner said, we had to save the economy. But then Geithner chimed in just recently. He says, we saved the economy, but we lost the country. And I do think in large measure, he's actually right that they have lost the country. And they've kicked the can in terms of all the costs and the degradation of the rule of law, so far down the road that everybody continues to pay. And this is why I, ultimately wrote the book and why I think others are out there saying, hey, wait a second. This doesn't work. It's our democracy that is come into question here, and I think there's going to be an ongoing. And certainly people are like, okay, the stock market's at the high. Let's just continue on, but it goes far, far beyond that. This gets into the very foundation of our democracy, and the rule of law and corruption and scandal. And this is why these issues need to be brought into the court of the public arena and the court of public opinion, because you can't engage these people within their own spheres of influence within the banks or within the halls of Congress. This is why the stuff needs to get out, and this is why, Michael, I appreciate your having me on. Sharing information in the public so that people can become informed, share it with others. And then ultimately bring pressure on these lowlifes.
Okay, let me ask a tough question. So, J.P. Morgan, in the banking industry for 20 years, you're obviously a numbers guy. So, if we start to look at the probabilities of how this system that you are so eloquently describing as messed up, the probabilities put us getting a resolution to this mess. We can go the direction of pragmatism and everyone comes to the table and we have a nice conversation and everyone rationally moves things to a point where it makes sense and good things are done. Or we can have a crash. You're a numbers guy. I know where I'm putting my bet for a resolution. So am I completely wrong to say it's going to be a crash that brings around change?
Well, ultimately that will bring about the change. But that's not to say that we're going to have an imminent crash. I think, again, we could have a series of mini crises that will bring some pressure. But yes, another crash would bring the pressure on, Wall Street and Washington that still needs to be brought to bear on these folks.
What's so scary about it too is if we start to just hype, and I'm just talking hypothetically here about a crash, but it seems like to me that a lot of pain would be required for real reform to happen. And I wonder, after watching what happened in the last 5-6 year cycle, I wonder that if there was another meltdown, that the Fed would go back to their same bag of tricks to elevate the equity market again, and that would maybe pacify people. So you would just continually kick the can down the road. I just wonder what could possibly, if you painstakingly go through all these details in your book, but I just wonder if, I tend to think that we're on a permanently sinking ship? And I just, you're optimistic and I'm pessimistic. So make me optimistic.
Well, the thing is, I mean, in my opinion, I mean, our kids, further future generations, they need to have something to grab onto. And that's why I want to, bring these points out and, exposure, transparency. That is ultimately the great disinfectant. And believe me, there are enormous forces and enormous amounts of money that want to just, keep the status quo because it's for the benefit of, a small, band of cronies. But, our kids deserve better. The thing that scares, in my opinion, scares Wall Street is this, the fact that there are still people out there saying, you know what? Forget Dodd Frank, forget all this other, stuff. Break up the banks.
Yep.
Break up the banks.
Yep.
And that to me is ultimately what has to happen here. These institutions need to be broken up, and Glass-Steagall needs to be brought back. From there, then you can start to get into rewriting the rules and regulations. But and that to me is the drum that just needs to continue to bang that drum, break up these banks. And when you look at the size of these institutions, I mean, they're screaming to be broken up.
Larry, so let me pick your brain about, I was just thinking about something. So let's say in the fall of 2008, we watched Bear Stearns disappear. We watched Lehman Brothers disappear. What would have been the net result for the vast majority of world citizens if Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, the last two standing pure investment banks, what would have been the net result if they would have disappeared too?
Well, I mean, I think, in my opinion, the only thing worse than bailing out the banks would have been not bailing out the banks. Okay? But the problem is, at that very point in time, what should have happened was, you know what? Guess what? We're saving the banks and we are wiping out management. Okay? So very methodically, Lloyd Blankfein, you're gone. Jamie Dimon, you're gone. Down to a certain layer. And guess what? We're bringing in new management in a very methodical fashion, and we're going to go about truly instituting some real reforms leading to the reinstitution of Glass-Steagall. And I would have hoped that by this point in time, Glass-Steagall would have been reinstituted, and these banks would have already been split up to bring a sense of integrity back into our financial system. But,
so the operative question here I'm not sure in your answer, was Goldman Sachs too big to fail?
Goldman Sachs, well, the thing is, the system as a whole was too big to fail, and it was all interconnected. I mean, through the derivatives market, and that continues to be the problem. The derivatives market, you can't look at one institution. They're ultimately all too big to fail. The system itself is too big to fail because of the interconnectedness of derivatives.
I'm just driving the point that I as an outsider looking in, I see Bear go away, I see Lehman go away, and I'm just wondering why the other two couldn't go away at that point in time too. We know why the answer is political connections, the elite, et cetera, but I'm just wondering system-wide, obviously Goldman Sachs was bigger, but what would the ramifications have been, do you think?
The ramifications, you know what? It would have been, economic turmoil, no doubt, because, where would the capital have come back in? It would have been a total economic meltdown. And that's not to say that, that it couldn't have been ultimately saved. But, because you look at what occurred in Sweden, and they're like, listen, we're going to either take the pain right now, which they did, and they turned their system, of finance around, and they got back on their feet in relatively short order. But again, our economy and financial system is much larger than Sweden's. So yes, there would have been enormous turmoil. And so I do think that ultimately, as painful and ugly as bailing out the banks is, and that we continue to pay, the price of bailing out those banks, I ultimately do think that they did the right thing in doing that. But they should have gone much further. They had all the leverage at that point. I'm meaning the central bankers and the political folks in Washington, and they were just, they rolled over.
Yep. Larry, listen, where is the best place? I mean, I appreciate all the insights tonight. We could go on forever. And your book is dense, and you break this stuff down in a very methodical way. I'm obviously going to go to Amazon. They can buy In Bed with Wall Street. Where is your blog? Where can people go to find out more about you and read up on your daily writings?
Yep, I appreciate that. My blog, and again, there would never have been a book if there weren't a blog. My blog is Sense on Sense, SENSE on CENTS, www.senseonsense.com.
Larry, hey, take care. Hopefully we can chat again when the big meltdown happens.
You know what? It's not a question of if, it truly is a question of when. So, Michael, I thank you.
Take care, Larry.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.